I'm a 19-year-old guy, and my life pretty much turned upside down a few weeks before I was supposed to start university. It all started when I logged into my college savings account, expecting to see around $40,000, money that my mom and dad had been setting aside for years. But when I checked, the balance showed zero. I tried refreshing the page, thinking there had to be some mistake, but it was still empty. All $40,000 gone. At first, I thought maybe my mom had moved the money to a different account or put it somewhere safer without telling me. My parents divorced when I was 13, and while they don't really get along, they always tried to keep things civil for my sake. I called her right away, and she sounded just as surprised as I was. She told me she hadn't touched the account. After a few minutes of going back and forth, she suggested I talk to my dad. She seemed hesitant, like she already had a bad feeling about where this was going. I wasn't too eager to talk to him either. My dad and I have had a rocky relationship since the divorce. He always felt like he got the short end of the stick in the split, constantly reminding me of how much he had to give up. Still, I figured he wouldn't mess with my future like this. I mean, he knew how important college was to me. But when I called him and asked if he knew anything about the missing money, he acted confused and told me he had no idea what I was talking about. Something didn't sit right with me, so I pushed harder. I asked if he was sure he hadn't taken anything out. He kept deflecting, saying stuff like, "Why would I do that?" And you know how tight things have been lately. His tone was getting more defensive, and that's when I started to realize he was hiding something. So I kept pressing until he finally snapped and admitted that he'd taken the money. He tried to justify it right away, saying he had no choice because of some debts and unexpected expenses that had come up. He went on and on about how hard things had been for him, how he was trying to keep things together, but it all just sounded like excuses. I could barely focus on what he was saying. I was just stuck on the fact that he'd drained my entire college fund. Everything I had been working towards, every plan I had made, was now up in the air. I asked him how he could do that to me, knowing that this was the money I needed for school. He went quiet for a moment, and then he let out a long sigh, saying he never wanted to tell me this way. But then he slipped up. He mentioned something about paying off a new car. My mind went blank for a second. A car? And then he let slip about a vacation he took with his new girlfriend. It felt like a punch to the gut. I lost it. I don't remember all the words that came out of my mouth, but I know I shouted things I never thought I'd say to him. He shouted back, accusing me of being selfish and not understanding the sacrifices he made as a parent. He kept saying that he deserved to use some of that money because raising me had been expensive. He even tried to make it seem like he did this for us, to keep himself afloat. But all I could think about was how he spent my future on a car and a vacation. I stormed out of that conversation, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I called my mom and told her everything, and she was furious. I could hear her trying to keep her voice steady as she promised to get involved and get my dad to pay back what he took. She even talked about taking legal action if he didn't cooperate, but I could tell she didn't have a lot of hope that he would just hand over the money. As the days went by, my dad kept doubling down. He sent me messages, trying to justify his actions, saying that I didn't appreciate all the sacrifices he'd made. He even hinted that if I kept pushing, he'd cut me off completely. I wasn't even sure what he meant by that. He hadn't really been there for me in years. Still, it hurt to think that things had come to this point. I reached out to my grandparents on my dad's side, hoping they might be able to talk some sense into him. They were shocked and disappointed when they heard what he had done. They promised to try and help, but they also seemed wary of getting too involved in the mess. It was like everyone wanted to keep the peace, but I was the only one losing out because of it. I started thinking about my options. Should I try to take legal action? Would it even be worth the time and money, considering how much this would mess up our family even more? Part of me wanted to just let it go and try to figure out a way to make it work without that money. But then I'd remember how he had lied to my face and spent what was supposed to be my chance at a better future. I talked to a few friends about it, and they were as angry as I was. They suggested I go public, share my story online to put pressure on my dad, maybe even embarrass him into paying it back. I didn't know if that was the right move. I didn't want to air all this dirty laundry for the world to see, but it felt like I was running out of options, and I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. That's when I started looking into online forums and found people in similar situations. It was comforting in a way to see that I wasn't alone, but it also made me realize that I might need to fight harder than I'd thought. And maybe, just maybe, sharing my story could help me find some way to get justice for what my dad had done. So I decided to write this post and see what advice or support might come my way. Update 1. After my initial Reddit post went up, I didn't expect it to blow up the way it did, but within a few days it had thousands of upvotes, and the comments were filled with advice, support, and some pretty harsh takes on my dad's behavior. People suggested everything from suing him to cutting off contact entirely. I even got a few private messages from people who had gone through similar situations. It was overwhelming, but at least I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. But then my dad found out about the post. He called me up, furious, saying I was airing family business to strangers on the internet. He demanded that I delete it immediately, accusing me of trying to ruin his reputation. I could hear the anger in his voice, like he thought he could scare me into taking it down. I told him I wasn't going to do that, not when he still hadn't given back a single cent of my college fund. He hung up on me, but the damage was already done, he knew, and he wasn't going to let this slide quietly. After that, it didn't take long for the rest of the family to get involved. My aunts, uncles, and even a few cousins somehow found out about the situation. Some of them messaged me privately, telling me they understood why I was upset but thought I should take down the post for the sake of the family. Others were more blunt, calling me selfish for dragging my dad's name through the mud. But then there were a few who actually sided with me, saying that what my dad did was completely wrong and that he should pay me back. My mom, though, was solidly in my corner. She suggested that we try mediation before things got even uglier. She thought maybe if we all sat down with a neutral third party, we could work something out without dragging this mess through the courts. I didn't think it would change much, but I was willing to try if it meant getting my college fund back. When she brought it up to my dad, though, he shut it down immediately. He told her that he had done nothing wrong and that I needed to respect him as my father. He made it clear that he wasn't interested in talking things out, at least not if it meant admitting he had done anything wrong. So much for mediation. After that, the texts started coming in from my dad, and they were nasty. He called me ungrateful and said that I was blowing this out of proportion. He told me I didn't understand what it was like to be a parent, how much he had sacrificed. He acted like I owed him, like the money he took was some sort of repayment for being his kid. I took screenshots of all the messages and shared some of them on Reddit, keeping everything anonymous, of course. The comments blew up again, with people telling me to hang on to the evidence in case things went further. In the middle of all this, my uncle, my dad's older brother, reached out. He's always been distant, the kind of relative who shows up to holidays but never gets too involved. So I was surprised when he sent me a long message saying he had my back. He told me he wasn't happy with what my dad did, and that if I needed any advice or help, I could count on him. It wasn't much, but it was the first time in days that I felt like maybe not everyone in the family saw me as the bad guy. But the drama kept escalating. My dad's girlfriend, the one he took on that vacation, messaged me too. She accused me of causing unnecessary drama and said that I should just let it go for the sake of the family. I didn't even respond. It was pretty clear where her loyalty lay, and I wasn't about to start arguing with someone who had benefited directly from my stolen college fund. The whole thing was starting to take its toll on me. One night, I just broke down. I didn't even know who to turn to anymore. Every conversation felt like a battle, and the pressure of figuring out my next steps was crushing. It felt like everything was slipping away from me, and all I could do was watch. That's when some Redditors suggested I start a GoFundMe to try and raise enough money to cover at least some of my college expenses. I wasn't sure at first. It felt weird to ask for help from strangers. But then I thought about the deadline my university had given me to secure funding and how I didn't have a lot of options left. So I set it up and shared the link on my original post. I couldn't believe what happened next. Donations started pouring in, small amounts at first, but then larger ones, along with messages of support. Within a week, it had gained serious traction. The total kept climbing, and suddenly it felt like I might have a chance of making this work, even if my dad never gave back a dime. Of course, when my dad found out about the GoFundMe, he lost it. He called again, this time angrier than before. He accused me of trying to make him look bad and said that I was using this to turn people against him. He even threatened to sue me for defamation, saying that I was spreading lies about him. I reminded him that I hadn't named him or shared any personal details, but he wouldn't hear it. Meanwhile, the support kept coming in. People on Reddit sent me hundreds of messages, encouraging me to keep going and reminding me that I wasn't in the wrong. Some even shared their own stories of dealing with difficult parents and toxic family situations. It was like a wave of solidarity, pushing me forward when I felt like giving up. The university's deadline for funding was creeping up fast, though, and I still didn't have enough to cover everything. That's when my mom told me she had a small savings account she'd kept hidden from my dad during the divorce. It wasn't much, only enough to cover about one semester, but it gave me a little more breathing room. I was touched that she had saved this for me, even if it wasn't the full solution. With the GoFundMe doing well and my mom's help, I started to see a glimmer of hope, but Redditors kept urging me to gather all the evidence I could, just in case my dad tried to make good on his threats. They pointed out that I might need it if I decided to take legal action. I wasn't sure if I was ready to go down that road yet, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let my dad walk all over me. Not anymore. Update 2. After the GoFundMe gained traction, I knew I needed to explore all my options. Some Redditors had recommended speaking to a lawyer, so I decided to take their advice. It took a bit of searching, but I found a local attorney who specialized in family disputes and financial matters. I set up a consultation, and we went over the details of what happened: the emptied account, the lack of any written agreement, and the fact that my dad had spent the money on personal expenses. The lawyer listened carefully, then laid out my options. He told me that suing my dad could be a long, expensive process and might not be worth it if my dad didn't have the funds to pay even if we won. But he also suggested a middle ground, sending a formal demand letter, asking for the money to be returned within 30 days. It wouldn't guarantee I'd get anything back, but it could put legal pressure on my dad and show him that I was serious. I decided to go ahead with the demand letter. The lawyer helped me draft it, keeping everything professional and to the point. We sent it out, and I could only imagine how my dad would react when he saw it. It didn't take long to find out. He called me within hours, livid. He said I was tearing the family apart and that I was letting money come between us. But all I could think about was that he was the one who had taken the money in the first place. After a few minutes of him ranting, he hung up, but it was clear he wasn't going to cooperate. A couple of days later, I got a call from my grandparents, my dad's parents. They had heard about the letter, and while they weren't happy that things had escalated this far, they offered to help with legal fees if I decided to take things further. They told me they were disappointed in my dad's actions and hoped that he would do the right thing. It was a relief to know they were in my corner, even if it came with a bit of guilt for dragging them into the mess. Meanwhile, the Reddit community had a lot to say about the demand letter. Some users even offered edits to the language of the letter, suggesting changes that might make it more effective. It was strange taking legal advice from strangers on the internet, but it seemed like every bit of pressure might help. My dad must have been feeling that pressure too, because a few days later, he took to Facebook with a long rant. In his post, he called me a disloyal child and accused me of turning the family against him. He went on about how he had done everything for me, and now I was trying to ruin his life over a simple misunderstanding. I found out about the post when a cousin sent me a screenshot, and it was surreal seeing my personal life laid out like that for everyone to read. But the backlash he got was immediate. Friends, neighbors, and even some extended family members started commenting in support of me, saying that he should pay back the money and that he was the one who had crossed the line. It didn't take long for word of the whole situation to spread beyond just our family. One local business owner, who had seen my story on Reddit, reached out with a job offer. They knew I was trying to save up for college and wanted to help. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was something. I accepted the offer, figuring that every little bit would help me get closer to my goal of starting school, even if it was going to be later than I had planned. But my dad didn't let up. After the Facebook post backfired, he doubled down and refused to even acknowledge the demand letter. He told anyone who would listen that he was being harassed by me and my mom. He made it clear that he had no intention of paying back the money, claiming that he had every right to it. That's when my mom decided to file for an adjustment in child support. Even though I was about to turn 20, she hoped that it might put some more financial pressure on him and force him to take responsibility. Around this time, my uncle, the same one who had reached out earlier, shared something I hadn't known before. He told me that my dad had a history of financial mismanagement, including some old gambling debts. He hadn't mentioned this before because he thought my dad had turned things around, but now he realized that might not have been the case. It added a new layer to everything, making me wonder if the debts he mentioned were real after all, or if he'd just used them as an excuse to take my money. Then, out of the blue, my dad's girlfriend broke up with him. Apparently, the stress of everything was too much, and she didn't want to be caught up in all the drama. My dad tried to spin it as if I was the one to blame, but from what I heard, she left because she didn't like how he was handling the situation. It was one more thing going wrong for him, and I could tell he was starting to unravel. Around this time, my dad had a minor health scare. He ended up in the hospital for a few days, nothing serious, but he tried to use it as leverage. He reached out to me, saying that the stress from the whole situation was affecting his health, and that he hoped I would drop the matter for the sake of his well-being. I didn't respond to that message. I wasn't going to let him use a health scare as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for what he did. With everything going on, the pressure was intense, but I decided to stay firm. Even with my dad's threats and attempts at guilt tripping, I couldn't just let him get away with taking the money. The GoFundMe was still going strong, the job was helping me save up, and I knew that I had the legal support if it came down to a court case. I wasn't sure how much longer this fight would go on, but I knew one thing I wasn't backing down. Update 3. Things escalated fast after we sent the demand letter. My dad refused to pay back the money, so my lawyer moved forward with filing a lawsuit. A few weeks later, my dad was served with the legal papers, and suddenly, things got real. It wasn't just angry phone calls or Facebook rants anymore. This was in the hands of the courts now. Not long after being served, my dad fired back with a counterclaim. He accused me of causing him emotional distress by sharing the story online and dragging his reputation through the mud. He argued that the Reddit post had damaged his standing in the community and made him a target for ridicule. I wasn't surprised that he tried to flip the narrative, but it still stung that he'd go this far to avoid taking responsibility. With the legal battle underway, my lawyer started the discovery process. This meant going through my dad's financial records, which turned up some surprising details. It wasn't just the new car and the vacation, there were purchases for expensive gadgets, a new entertainment system, and payments to some questionable online services. It was clear that my dad had been spending beyond his means for a while, and the money he took from my college fund had only been a temporary fix for a much bigger problem. Meanwhile, my story kept gaining traction on Reddit. Supporters shared it across different subreddits and even more people got involved. Some of them were able to find details about the case through public records, and the pressure on my dad kept building. It was a strange feeling, seeing so many strangers rallying behind me, but their support was keeping me going. They reminded me that I wasn't alone in this fight. The GoFundMe I had set up kept growing, too. It had already surpassed its initial goal, and now it had enough to cover at least 2 years of tuition. I was blown away by the generosity of people I'd never met. Then, out of the blue, a distant relative I'd only met a couple of times reached out through the GoFundMe main page. They left a substantial donation with a message saying they wanted to help make things right. It was enough to give me hope that I'd be able to start school sooner rather than later. While the online community was supporting me, things weren't going so well for my dad offline. His counterclaim drew even more attention to the story, and people in our town started to take sides. Some of his old friends and neighbors, who had initially stayed quiet, began speaking out against him. It wasn't long before word reached his workplace. I heard through a mutual connection that he had been put on probation at his job, with his employer citing concerns about his conduct outside of work. I could tell he was feeling the heat, but instead of backing down, he just got more desperate. One evening, my uncle reached out again, saying there might be another twist in all of this. He told me that when my grandparents had set up my college fund, they also set up a small trust fund that my dad had apparently tried to access a few years back. It wasn't a huge amount, but it added another layer to the story. one that painted my dad in an even worse light. My uncle suggested that if we could prove my dad had tried to dip into the trust fund before, it might help our case in court. In the middle of all this, I started receiving some strange, anonymous messages. They came through different social media platforms, and most of them were filled with insults and threats, accusing me of being a bad son and telling me to back off from my dad. I couldn't be sure who was sending them, but I had a pretty good idea that they were connected to my dad's friends, people who believed his side of the story. I took screenshots of every message and sent them to my lawyer, just in case things escalated further. Then, out of nowhere, my dad reached out trying to reconcile. He offered a half-hearted apology, saying he was willing to talk if I agreed to take down my Reddit posts and stop the legal action. But there was no mention of returning the money, and it felt more like damage control than a genuine apology. I turned him down and told him that I wasn't going to back down until he made things right. The conversation ended there, and I didn't hear from him again for a while. Not long after that, my dad's ex-girlfriend reached out to me. She sent a long message explaining how my dad had manipulated her too, making promises that he never kept. She said she was sorry for the role she played in everything and that she hoped I got the justice I deserved. It didn't change much, but it was a small validation that I wasn't imagining things. My dad really had been trying to manipulate everyone around him. Amidst all the chaos, I started my new job. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt good to have something to focus on besides the ongoing legal battle. I worked long shifts and saved every penny I could, knowing that it would help bridge the gap until I could access my GoFundMe funds for school. It felt like a small step toward reclaiming some control over my future. Then, I got some unexpected good news from my university. They reached out to let me know they had reconsidered my situation and were offering me a partial scholarship. It wouldn't cover everything, but between the scholarship, the GoFundMe, and my job, I was closer than ever to making my college plans work again. For the first time in months, I felt like I could see a way forward. Around this time, the local community organized a small fundraiser event for me. It wasn't something I had asked for, but they insisted. They wanted to show support and help me get back on track. People from all over town showed up, sharing their encouragement and contributing what they could. It felt surreal seeing how this had become such a big story in our town, but I was grateful for the support. The legal battle was still ongoing, and I knew that the next steps wouldn't be easy. But I had more support than I ever imagined, from family, from strangers on the internet, and even from the people in my own community. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew one thing I wasn't going to give up. Not until my dad finally faced the consequences of what he had done. Update 4. The first court hearing came up faster than I expected. My dad and I both showed up with our lawyers, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. It was strange seeing him there sitting just a few feet away, but it was like we were worlds apart. The judge laid out how the proceedings would go, and then it all began. My dad's lawyer was the first to speak. He launched into a speech about how my dad was a struggling single father who had done his best to provide for me. He tried to make it sound like my dad was the real victim here, caught up in a misunderstanding. When my dad took the stand, he gave this emotional testimony, talking about how he had sacrificed so much for me over the years, and how my actions had ruined his reputation and caused him unbearable stress. He kept wiping his eyes, trying to look sympathetic, but it felt more like a performance than anything else. Then it was my turn. My lawyer presented the evidence we had gathered, bank statements showing the withdrawals from the college fund, and records of my dad's extravagant purchases. He laid out how the money had been spent on the new car, the vacation, and other luxuries. I could see the judge taking notes, nodding as he listened to each point. It felt like we were finally being heard. The judge didn't hold back. He addressed my dad directly, warning him about the seriousness of the accusations and making it clear that if he had indeed taken the funds for personal use, there could be serious legal consequences. My dad's lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge shut him down, insisting that this was a matter that deserved full attention. The tension in the room was thick. You could almost hear a pin drop. To my surprise, several members of the community had submitted letters of support on my behalf. They talked about my work ethic, my dreams of going to college, and how they had seen me trying to overcome the challenges my dad's actions had thrown in my path. The judge read through a few of them, taking note of the positive things they had to say. It felt like a small victory, knowing that the community hadn't turned their back on me, even with all the drama my dad had stirred up. Then things took a turn. My dad's lawyer switched tactics and went after my motives. He questioned why I had shared the story online, implying that I was only trying to shame my dad publicly to gain sympathy and money through the GoFundMe. He even suggested that I was using the situation as a way to manipulate people into donating to me. It was tough to hear, but my lawyer countered by pointing out that the Reddit posts had come after my dad refused to address the issue privately. It was a back and forth that left the courtroom buzzing. Next, my mom took the stand. She talked about how my dad had a long history of making poor financial decisions and manipulating people to get what he wanted. She brought up the gambling debts that my uncle had mentioned, painting a picture of a man who had always put his own interests above others. My dad didn't take it well. He interrupted her a few times, raising his voice until the judge had to step in and warn him to keep his composure. He looked like he was about to explode, but he managed to hold back, for now. After my mom's testimony, my dad's lawyer called for a break, and when we returned, they made an offer. My dad proposed a settlement. He'd pay back a small fraction of what he took, and in return, I would drop the lawsuit and take down all the posts about the situation. It was way less than what he owed me. not even enough to cover a full semester of tuition. I didn't even have to think twice about it. I refused. My lawyer advised me that we should push for the full repayment and possibly even seek damages for the stress and trouble this whole mess had caused. That's when things got even more interesting. My dad's ex-girlfriend, the one he'd taken on vacation, reached out through my lawyer. She offered to testify on my behalf, saying she wanted to share what she knew about my dad's spending. She revealed that he had never mentioned financial struggles when they were together and had always acted like he had plenty of money to throw around. It added more weight to our case, and my lawyer didn't hesitate to include her testimony. Word of the case reached local media. A small news outlet picked up the story, turning it into a headline about a dad who allegedly stole his son's college fund. It wasn't exactly flattering for my dad, and it only increased the pressure on him. More people in town found out what was happening, and I heard through the grapevine that my dad was struggling with the attention. His reputation was taking a serious hit, and I think he finally realized that this wasn't going to go away quietly. Back in court, my lawyer presented more detailed records of my dad's spending. We highlighted purchases he had made just after draining my account, things that couldn't be justified as basic living expenses. It painted a clear picture of someone who had used my college savings as a personal piggy bank. My dad's lawyer tried to argue that these purchases were necessary, but the evidence was too solid to ignore. After reviewing everything, the judge announced that he needed time to make a final decision. He wanted to go over all the evidence before issuing a verdict. My dad and I left the courtroom, knowing that the next hearing could be the one that decided everything. The tension between us was thick, and I could see the frustration on his face. But there wasn't much left to say. As we walked out of the courthouse, I could hear people murmuring about the case, the whispers following us. It was clear that everyone was waiting to see how this would play out. All I could do now was keep moving forward and hope that justice would finally be served. Update 5. The final court hearing came, and it felt like the whole town was watching. My dad and I stood on opposite sides of the courtroom, each of us with our lawyers ready for closing arguments. The air was thick with tension. My dad looked worn down, but there was still a stubbornness in his eyes. My lawyer presented our side, emphasizing the evidence we had uncovered, every dollar that had gone missing, every bank statement that showed my dad's spending spree. He wrapped up by asking the judge to hold my dad accountable for taking the money that was meant for my education. My dad's lawyer made one last attempt to paint me as a manipulative son who had dragged my dad through the mud for sympathy. He tried to claim that the emotional distress my dad suffered from the Reddit post outweighed any mistakes my dad might have made. But the judge didn't seem swayed by their arguments. He took a deep breath and addressed the courtroom, delivering his verdict. The judge ruled in my favor. He ordered my dad to repay the full amount of the $40,000 he had taken from my college fund. He emphasized that the money was intended for my education, and that my dad's actions had directly jeopardized my future. He also added that if my dad didn't start making payments soon, further legal action could be taken against him. As soon as the hearing ended, my dad stormed out of the courtroom. People gathered outside, curious about the outcome, and he couldn't hold back his anger. He had a full-on meltdown right there on the courthouse steps, yelling about how everyone had turned against him, me, my mom, the judge, even the community. He claimed he was the real victim, that he had only tried to do what was best for me. It was chaotic, with people watching in shock, and some even recording it on their phones. The scene quickly made its way to social media, and my dad's ranting only made things worse for him. The community's reaction was immediate. Word spread that the judge had ruled in my favor, and people started treating it like a victory. They congratulated me when they saw me at work or around town, saying that justice had finally been served. Even people who had stayed neutral before seemed relieved that my dad was being held accountable. It felt like the whole town was rallying behind me, and the local news picked up the story again, framing it as a case of a young guy standing up for what was right. But my dad wasn't done fighting. Even with the court order, he refused to pay back the money. Days passed, then weeks, and nothing came through. My lawyer warned me that we might need to take further action, so we started the process to garnish his wages. It was the only way to ensure that I'd actually see the money that the court said I was owed. My dad tried to argue against it, but the legal system wasn't on his side anymore. Meanwhile, the divide in the family grew even deeper. Some of my relatives cut ties with my dad entirely, saying they couldn't support what he had done. Others still thought I should have kept the whole thing private, but they stopped trying to pressure me to back down. It felt like the family was split down the middle, and there wasn't much hope of repairing the rift anytime soon. Just when I thought things might be settling down, I got another piece of good news. The university I had been accepted to reached out, offering me a full scholarship. They had been following the story and decided that my situation warranted the extra support. It was like a weight had been lifted. I finally had a clear path forward, and I wouldn't have to rely entirely on the GoFundMe to pay for school. But my dad's troubles weren't over. The negative attention surrounding the case caught up with him at work, and he ended up losing his job. I heard about it through mutual acquaintances, and while I wouldn't wish that kind of situation on anyone, it was clear that his refusal to take responsibility had consequences. It wasn't long before he issued a public apology through a social media post, claiming that he was sorry for everything and hoped we could rebuild our relationship. But it felt like too little, too late. I didn't respond, and I kept my distance. It wasn't about holding a grudge, it was about knowing that some things couldn't just be forgiven with a few words. With the garnished wages, the full scholarship, and the remaining donations from the GoFundMe, I was finally in a stable position. I could afford to focus on my studies without worrying about how to make ends meet. The community continued to show support, and I knew that I had a lot of people rooting for me to succeed. I shared a final update on Reddit, letting everyone know how things had turned out. I wrote about the court's decision, the scholarship, and how I was planning to move forward with my life. The post went viral, with thousands of upvotes and comments from people who had been following my story from the start. Many congratulated me for standing my ground, and some even shared how my story had inspired them to stand up for themselves in tough situations. It felt like I had come full circle, from that first post where I was unsure what to do, to this moment where I could finally close this chapter. Reflecting on everything, I realized how much my perspective on family and trust had changed. It's hard to describe what it's like to be betrayed by someone who's supposed to look out for you, but it's even harder to fight back when it feels like the world is against you. But through all of it, I learned that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it's messy and painful. As I wrapped up my last Reddit update, I left a message of gratitude to everyone who had supported me, from the kind strangers online to the neighbors in my town. I promised to focus on my studies and work toward a better future. And then I logged off for what I hoped would be the last time in a while. It was time to focus on my new beginning and leave the past behind. The future still has its uncertainties, but for the first time in a long while, it feels like I'm the one in control, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. I'm a 34-year-old man, and for as long as I can remember, I've wanted to be a father. Life doesn't always go as planned, though. Years ago, I found out I was infertile. It was devastating at the time, but as I processed the news, I realized that being a dad wasn't about biology, it was about love, care, and commitment. Adoption became my dream, and recently I started making that dream a reality. Adoption as a single man isn't easy. There's a ton of preparation involved, emotionally and financially. I spent years saving money, working extra shifts, and building a stable environment to offer a child a good life. The process is thorough, as it should be, and every step felt like climbing a mountain. Still, I was determined. At first, my sister Rachel, who's 32, seemed supportive. She even joked about how I'd probably have a kid before she managed to have a second one. Rachel and her husband have a 6-year-old daughter but have been struggling financially, so I didn't think much of her comments. I figured she was just venting a bit of frustration. But as time went on, her tone shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, just subtle remarks about how hard parenting is and how I might not realize what I was getting into. I brushed it off as typical sibling banter. Then, during a family gathering, things got more pointed. Rachel brought up my adoption plans in front of everyone, saying I should think about what's best for everyone instead of being selfish. I was caught off guard. Selfish? All I wanted was to give a child a loving home. But I let it slide, not wanting to make a scene. My parents stayed quiet, and the subject quickly changed, but the moment stuck with me. Despite Rachel's comments, I pressed forward. The home study was the next big hurdle, a detailed evaluation to determine if I was fit to adopt. It's intimidating, to say the least. Social workers visited my home, asked me endless questions, and reviewed my finances. It felt invasive but necessary. When I got the news that I'd passed, I was thrilled. It was a major milestone, and I thought my family would celebrate with me. Instead, Rachel seemed annoyed. She mentioned how lucky I was to have saved enough money for this process, hinting at her own struggles. It was awkward, but I tried not to let her comments dampen my excitement. However, not long after, I started hearing whispers. Extended family members called, expressing vague concerns about whether adoption was the right path for me. One even suggested I think carefully before going through with it. It didn't take long to figure out where these doubts were coming from. I confronted Rachel directly, asking if she'd been talking to the family about my plans. She denied it at first, but then claimed she was just worried about how our parents might handle the stress of me adopting. I didn't buy it. I told her this was my decision, and that I wasn't going to let anyone's opinion stop me. She shrugged it off, but didn't seem happy. The toll of all this was starting to add up. Adoption isn't just emotionally draining, it's expensive, time-consuming, and full of uncertainties. Knowing that someone I cared about might be sabotaging my efforts was devastating. Still, when I got the call saying I'd been added to the waitlist to adopt a 3-year-old boy, I was overjoyed. It felt like a light at the end of the tunnel. But Rachel's reaction? A mix of indifference and passive aggressiveness. She started posting vague social media updates about people making reckless decisions and rushing into things. At first, I ignored it, but then family members started asking me if I was sure about the adoption. Rachel's words were getting to them, and it was infuriating. Then came the turning point. One evening, the adoption agency called. They'd received an anonymous tip questioning my suitability to be a parent. The tip alleged I was financially unstable and emotionally unprepared. Hearing this felt like a punch to the gut. The agency reassured me they were still moving forward with my case, but asked for additional documentation to clear up the concerns. I immediately suspected Rachel. Who else would go this far to undermine me? I was heartbroken and furious. Rachel had crossed a line, but when I tried to confront her again, she played dumb. She even implied that maybe the agency had legitimate reasons to double-check things. Her smugness was infuriating, but without concrete proof, I couldn't outright accuse her. Despite everything, I wasn't going to back down. I'd come too far to let someone else's bitterness derail my dream. This was about more than me, it was about giving a child a chance at a better life. Even if I had to fight tooth and nail, I wasn't giving up. The adoption process had tested me in ways I never expected, but it had also shown me just how strong my resolve was. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of the battle. Update 1. When the adoption agency called me in for a meeting about the anonymous tip, I knew it wasn't going to be a casual conversation. I sat across from the caseworker, who explained the details of the complaint. It alleged that I was financially unstable and emotionally unprepared to care for a child. The words felt like a slap, but I stayed calm. They told me they needed additional financial documentation and references to confirm my suitability. It was frustrating but understandable. They had a child's best interests to consider. Back at home, I spent hours gathering every piece of evidence I could find. Bank statements, pay stubs, even a letter from my employer confirming my steady position. I contacted friends who had already agreed to be references, explaining the situation. They were shocked but supportive, offering to do whatever they could to help. While I was busy preparing, Rachel called. The conversation started off casual, but something about her tone was off. Then, she slipped. She mentioned details about the anonymous complaint, details I hadn't shared with anyone. My stomach dropped. How could she know that unless she was the one who made the call? When I pressed her, she tried to backtrack, saying she'd just heard things from the family. But the damage was done. I knew it was her. I ended the call and sat there, piecing everything together. Rachel's comments at family gatherings, her passive-aggressive posts, the sudden doubts being voiced by relatives, it all pointed back to her. She'd been undermining me from the start. I vented to a close friend later that night. They didn't mince words, telling me Rachel's actions were toxic and suggesting I distance myself from her. It wasn't easy to hear, but they were right. I couldn't let her sabotage this any further. The next day, I brought it up with my parents. My dad was furious. He said if Rachel had done this, I needed to cut ties with her for good. My mom, on the other hand, was defensive. She refused to believe Rachel would stoop so low, insisting there had to be a misunderstanding. This only added to the tension. Suddenly, my family was split down the middle, and Rachel wasn't making things any easier. She started calling relatives, painting me as obsessive and claiming I wasn't thinking clearly. A few of them bought into it, repeating her words back to me in carefully veiled conversations. The narrative she was building was relentless, but I refused to let it shake my resolve. I had come too far to give up now. Out of nowhere, Rachel's husband reached out. He apologized for her behavior, admitting that he didn't agree with what she was doing. But he stopped short of trying to stop her, saying it wasn't his place to interfere. It wasn't the outright support I wanted, but at least it confirmed I wasn't imagining things. Rachel was actively working against me. The adoption agency got back to me a few days later. They had reviewed my financial documents and reached out to my references, all of whom vouched for me. They assured me my financial stability was no longer in question. However, they were upfront about their lingering concerns. The anonymous complaint had triggered additional scrutiny, and it wasn't something they could ignore. The process would be delayed while they conducted further checks. Just as I was processing this, Rachel sent me a long message. She accused me of overcompensating for being single, claiming I wasn't equipped to handle the challenges of parenting. It was an unprovoked, cruel attack, and it was clear she wasn't going to back down. I blocked her number and took a deep breath. Enough was enough. I decided to share my experience publicly, without naming Rachel, of course. I posted about the struggles I'd faced during the adoption process and the unexpected obstacles thrown my way. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. Friends and even acquaintances reached out, offering encouragement and sharing their own stories of overcoming challenges. But not everyone was on my side. Some mutual friends, clearly influenced by Rachel's narrative, began acting distant, avoiding my calls and ignoring my messages. The background check the agency had to conduct delayed everything by weeks. It was agonizing, knowing that this entire situation had been avoidable if not for one person's petty interference. But I stayed focused. I couldn't let Rachel win. This wasn't just about me, it was about giving a child a chance at a better life. Every time I thought about giving up, I remembered why I started this journey. Despite the chaos Rachel had caused, I wasn't going to let her destroy my dream of becoming a dad. This was only the beginning, and I was ready to fight for what mattered most. Update 2. A few weeks after the anonymous complaint delayed my adoption process, I got a call from a family friend. She had overheard Rachel talking at a gathering, confidently claiming I was financially reckless and emotionally unstable, the same allegations made in the anonymous tip. When pressed, Rachel admitted she had shared concerns with some people but brushed it off as harmless. It wasn't harmless, though. Her words were the reason my adoption process had stalled. This friend also revealed something even more troubling. Rachel had mentioned feeling overshadowed by my adoption plans. Apparently, she didn't want to compete with me in parenting. It was a petty motive, but it explained her behavior. She saw my decision to adopt as a threat to her standing in the family. Armed with this new information, I decided it was time to confront Rachel directly. A family dinner seemed like the right opportunity, especially since my parents would be there. As soon as everyone had settled in, I brought it up. I laid out the evidence, her comments to our relatives, the similarities between the anonymous complaint and her words, and the impact her actions had on my adoption process. Rachel's reaction was immediate. She denied everything, but her face said otherwise. When I mentioned specifics, like the exact phrases she'd used to describe me, she looked visibly shaken. Her denial only made things worse, and the room erupted into chaos. My dad sided with me, demanding Rachel own up to her actions, while my mom insisted I was blowing things out of proportion. Other family members tried to stay neutral, but it was clear lines were being drawn. The fallout was brutal. Some relatives called to tell me they believed me and supported my decision to adopt. Others told me I should let it go, claiming Rachel didn't mean any harm. It felt like I was caught in the middle of a storm, but I stayed focused. The adoption agency was still conducting their investigation, and I couldn't afford any more distractions. A few days later, I got an update from the agency. They had cleared me of all accusations, confirming my financial stability and emotional preparedness. While it was a relief, they warned me that future complaints could jeopardize the process. It was a reminder that this wasn't over yet. I made the decision to cut contact with Rachel temporarily. I needed to focus on my adoption journey and couldn't let her toxic behavior derail me any further. When she realized I wasn't speaking to her, she retaliated. She accused me of turning the family against her and started posting cryptic updates online about betrayal and family drama. It was exhausting, but I ignored her antics. Instead, I leaned on my support network. Close friends and family members who believed in me helped me stay grounded. One friend, a lawyer, advised me to start documenting everything Rachel had done, from her comments to the anonymous complaint. It was solid advice. If Rachel tried to sabotage me again, I'd be ready. Out of the blue, Rachel reached out with what she called an apology. She claimed she had been looking out for me and only wanted to make sure I was making the right decision. It wasn't sincere, and it didn't change anything. I responded firmly, making it clear she would not be involved in my life or my future child's life unless she took accountability and changed her behavior. Not long after, my parents called for a family meeting, hoping to mediate. I reluctantly agreed, thinking it might help clear the air. It didn't. Rachel arrived defensive and hostile, accusing me of trying to destroy her reputation. When I reminded her of the impact her actions had on my adoption process, she stormed out. My dad supported my decision to hold her accountable, but my mom still seemed torn, urging me to keep the peace. Despite the ongoing drama, there was a bright spot. The adoption agency called to let me know my application was back on track. They had completed their investigation and cleared me to move forward. Hearing that news felt like a weight had been lifted. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of hope. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized how much stronger I had become. Rachel's interference had tested me in ways I never imagined, but it had also reaffirmed my commitment to adopting. This wasn't just about proving her wrong, it was about building a future for myself and the child I would soon welcome into my life. I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. Update 3. When the call came from the adoption agency, my heart stopped. This time, it wasn't another complication, it was the news I had been waiting for. My adoption of a 3-year-old boy, Ethan, had been approved. After all the setbacks, the delays, and the drama, it felt surreal. I thanked the agency, hung up, and immediately started calling the people who had stood by me through everything. My dad was over the moon. Close friends were ecstatic. I didn't even bother telling Rachel. She found out anyway. My parents, excited about Ethan, likely mentioned it to her in passing. Not long after, I received a long, angry text from her. It accused me of ruining her reputation, claiming I had turned the entire family against her. She even said I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I didn't respond. I blocked her number along with all her social media profiles, determined to focus on what mattered: Ethan. The day Ethan came home was nothing short of magical. The moment I saw him, I knew all the struggles had been worth it. He was shy at first, clutching a small stuffed bear and looking around nervously. I knelt down and introduced myself, showing him the room I had set up just for him, complete with a bed shaped like a car and walls decorated with his favorite cartoon characters. Slowly but surely, he began to warm up to me. That first evening, we played with blocks, read a bedtime story, and shared a quiet moment as he drifted off to sleep. It was everything I had dreamed of. Rachel, of course, couldn't let me have a moment of peace. She sent another email to the adoption agency, claiming I was unfit to care for a child. This time, the allegation was so outlandish that the agency immediately dismissed it. They called me to let me know what had happened and assured me that my adoption of Ethan was final. They weren't going to entertain any more baseless complaints. My dad, who had been quietly supportive throughout the process, finally lost his patience with Rachel. He called her out, telling her in no uncertain terms that her behavior was unacceptable. She didn't take it well. Within hours, she posted a long-winded rant on social media, painting herself as the victim. She blamed me for tearing the family apart and accused my dad of favoritism. The post got a mixed response. Some people sympathized with her, but many others saw through her dramatics. My mom, torn between her children, tried to mediate. She suggested I reconcile with Rachel for the sake of family unity. I refused. I told her I was done with Rachel's toxic behavior and needed to focus on Ethan. It didn't go over well, but I stood my ground. This wasn't just about me anymore. I had a son to think about. Life with Ethan quickly became my new normal. We spent our days exploring parks, visiting the library, and working on puzzles together. I enrolled in parenting classes to make sure I was giving him the best care possible. Watching him grow more confident and happy was the most rewarding experience of my life. Still, Rachel wasn't done. She escalated her attacks, this time anonymously contacting Child Protective Services (CPS). The accusation? Neglect. When CPS showed up at my door, I was stunned but cooperative. They conducted a thorough inspection of my home, reviewed Ethan's medical records, and interviewed me. After a few days, they cleared me of any wrongdoing and closed the case. While I was relieved, it was also a wake-up call. Rachel's actions weren't just petty anymore. They were dangerous. I consulted a lawyer to discuss my options. The lawyer recommended taking steps to legally protect myself and Ethan, whether through a restraining order or another form of intervention. It was a sobering moment. I had always hoped Rachel would come around, but her actions made it clear she wouldn't stop unless forced to. Meanwhile, Ethan was thriving. He started laughing more, opening up about his favorite toys and games, and even began calling me dad. Every milestone was a reminder of why I had fought so hard to adopt him. My lawyer filed the necessary paperwork to begin the process of securing a restraining order against Rachel. As I waited for the legal proceedings to play out, I realized this was the last straw. Rachel's interference had gone too far, and it was time to make a decisive move. My focus had to remain on Ethan and building a peaceful, loving home for him. Whatever it took, I would make sure Rachel could never disrupt our lives again. Update 4. The first step in protecting Ethan and myself was documenting everything Rachel had done. I compiled a detailed record of her harassment, texts, emails, and even screenshots of her social media posts. Family and friends who had witnessed her behavior provided written statements. The CPS visit was the tipping point, and my lawyer assured me the evidence was strong enough to support a restraining order. Filing the legal paperwork felt both empowering and nerve-wracking. Rachel's interference had gone from petty sabotage to dangerous escalation, and I couldn't risk her causing further harm. The restraining order cited her repeated harassment, including the false CPS complaint and her attempts to disrupt the adoption process. My lawyer filed it quickly, and we waited for the court date. News of the restraining order spread through the family like wildfire. My dad fully supported my decision and didn't hold back in calling out Rachel's behavior. A few relatives sided with me as well, saying Rachel's actions had gone too far. But others accused me of overreacting. They said I was tearing the family apart by taking legal action against my own sister. It was frustrating, but I stayed focused. This wasn't about the family, it was about protecting Ethan. At the court hearing, Rachel tried to justify her actions, claiming she was only acting in Ethan's best interest. She painted herself as the concerned aunt, insisting she had no malicious intent. But the judge wasn't buying it. The evidence was overwhelming, and her flimsy excuses didn't hold up under scrutiny. The court granted the restraining order, barring Rachel from contacting me, Ethan, or the adoption agency in any way. Rachel's fury was immediate. She retaliated by cutting off contact with my parents, blaming them for taking my side. My dad shrugged it off, but my mom struggled with the rift. She became increasingly torn, trying to convince me to reconcile with Rachel for the sake of family unity. When I refused, the tension between us grew. Despite the legal win, the emotional toll was heavy. I started therapy to process everything that had happened, the harassment, the family drama, and the constant stress. The therapist helped me focus on creating a healthy, stable environment for Ethan. I learned how to navigate the guilt of family estrangement while prioritizing my role as a father. Rachel wasn't done stirring up trouble, even from a distance. She pressured our mom to choose sides, which led to more arguments and strained relationships. My mom eventually gave me an ultimatum: reconcile with Rachel or risk losing her support. It was a heartbreaking moment, but I refused to give in. I calmly told her that if she couldn't respect my boundaries, I would have to limit contact with her as well. My dad, ever supportive, reassured me I was doing the right thing. He started visiting more often, helping me with parenting tasks and offering advice as I adjusted to life with Ethan. The support I found outside the family was just as crucial. I joined a local group for single parents, where I met others who understood the unique challenges of raising a child alone. Their encouragement and shared experiences made me feel less isolated. They celebrated milestones with me, like the day Ethan first called me dad. Hearing that word from him solidified everything I had worked for. He was thriving, laughing more, making friends at the park, and settling into his new life. With the restraining order in place, Rachel finally went silent. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. There were no more surprise emails, no anonymous complaints, and no cryptic social media posts. Ethan and I could finally focus on building our life together without the shadow of her interference. The journey wasn't easy, but every step reaffirmed my decision to protect Ethan at all costs. The family rift was painful, but I knew I had made the right choice. Ethan's happiness and well-being came first, and I wasn't going to let anyone jeopardize that. Update 5. It's been a year since Ethan officially became my son, and looking back, it feels like a lifetime ago that I was caught up in the chaos Rachel caused. Ethan and I have come so far since that day, and the transformation has been incredible. He's now a confident, happy 4-year-old who loves preschool, his new friends, and anything to do with dinosaurs. Watching him grow and thrive has been the most rewarding experience of my life. Ethan started preschool a few months after moving in with me, and while he was shy at first, he's blossomed. His teachers have commented on how quickly he adjusted, and he's even made a best friend, a boy named Liam who lives just down the street. Every morning, Ethan looks forward to school, and in the afternoons, we spend time playing in the park or reading his favorite dinosaur books. His laughter fills the house now, a far cry from the quiet, hesitant child who first walked through my door. My relationship with my dad has remained solid throughout this journey. He's been a constant presence, always ready with advice or a helping hand. He's even taken on the role of grandpa with enthusiasm, spoiling Ethan with small gifts and trips to the toy store. My mom, on the other hand, has been more complicated. While we still speak occasionally, our relationship is limited. She's still conflicted about Rachel, though she seems to have accepted that reconciliation isn't on the table. I keep our conversations polite but brief, focusing on Ethan and steering clear of family drama. As for Rachel, she's stayed out of my life entirely. The restraining order, combined with the loss of family support, seems to have kept her at bay. I've heard through mutual friends that her marriage is struggling, and part of the tension comes from her inability to let go of her obsession with my life. While I wouldn't wish harm on her, I can't deny the relief I feel knowing she's no longer able to interfere with my family. Therapy has been a game changer. Over the past year, I've worked through the lingering effects of Rachel's actions and the broader family dynamics that allowed her behavior to go unchecked for so long. My therapist has helped me focus on setting healthy boundaries and building a life centered on positivity and growth. It's been hard work, but I'm in a much better place now. To celebrate Ethan's adoption anniversary, I threw a small party with close friends and supportive family members. We kept it simple: cake, balloons, and lots of laughter. Ethan was the star of the day, running around with his friends and showing off his favorite dinosaur toys. It was a beautiful moment, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about us. My mom even attended and, to my surprise, apologized for pressuring me to reconcile with Rachel. She admitted she hadn't fully understood the harm Rachel had caused and thanked me for standing firm. It felt like a step forward. My dad, as always, had the perfect advice. He pulled me aside during the party and reminded me to keep focusing on Ethan and my own happiness. "The past is the past," he said, "and you've built something amazing here. Don't let anyone take that from you." His words stuck with me, and I've carried them forward ever since. One of the unexpected joys of this journey has been the friendships I've formed with other single parents. Through local support groups and preschool events, I've built a network of people who understand the unique challenges and triumphs of raising a child alone. These friendships have been a source of encouragement and inspiration, reminding me that I'm not in this alone. On the legal front, my lawyer recently checked in to confirm that Rachel hasn't made any attempts to contest the restraining order or interfere further. It's a relief to know that chapter of my life is truly closed. Without her constant meddling, I've been able to focus entirely on Ethan and our future. Career-wise, things have also been looking up. I recently received a promotion at work, which has provided additional financial stability. It's allowed me to plan for things like a family vacation, something Ethan and I are both excited about. Every decision I make now is with him in mind, and knowing I can provide him with security and opportunities is deeply fulfilling. Looking ahead, my priority is teaching Ethan the values that matter most: kindness, resilience, and the importance of chosen family. While our biological family may not be perfect, we've built a new family from the people who truly care about us. It's a lesson I hope he carries with him as he grows. As I write this final update, I'm filled with gratitude. Despite the obstacles, I found peace, joy, and a sense of purpose in raising Ethan. Our journey hasn't been easy, but it's been worth every challenge. The future looks bright, and I can't wait to see what's next for us.